Hello, everyone, and welcome to this IRO Summit on the Preventing of Fraud. I'm Patrick Hennessey, Vice President and General Manager of Resident Screening at Yardi Systems. And with me today is Paul Vengilio. Paul, would you mind doing a quick introduction for us?
Yeah, how you doing? I've been in the property management and similar worlds for about 20-something years, and I've worked for a very large company, Sterling Equities, and my family is also we have a portfolio of our own that we've been managing, and it's been growing over the last almost the same amount of time, and that's something that my responsibility in the family management of that has gotten larger and larger, and implementing newer technologies to make their jobs easier.
That's great. Well, thank you for being here, Paul, today. We thought you were the perfect fit for this, having seen sort of the evolution of all these different technologies coming over the last several years during your day job. And then now a lot of these technologies kind of emerging and becoming available for the smaller landlords, and seeing your family business embrace them. So thank you for being here today, and excited to pick your brain a little bit.
Absolutely.
Before we jump into our interview, just want to talk a little bit about how fraud has become such a hot topic in the multifamily space. And from everything we're seeing and hearing, there's a few kind of key drivers behind all this. First, as we all know, more and more is moving online. And so online leasing became quite prevalent starting 10 years ago or so, even before in many cases. But we really saw a major spike at the beginning of COVID as everything had to move remote, and there was less and less human interaction. And so between February of 2020 and May of 2020, we saw a 35% increase in the number of people applying online. And so the less human interaction there is, the more ability there is for people to kind of game the system and potentially slip through the cracks without anyone keeping a close eye on who's applying and leasing and moving in. We've also seen a huge spike in properties doing more self-guided touring. And self-guided touring had come along in a few different parts of multifamily and single-family home rentals over the last several years. COVID was a big boost for it, where people couldn't be on site to give tours. And now I think a lot of people have become comfortable with the idea on the owner-operator side of allowing for self-guided tours. And I think we're seeing it on the renter side, demand for people to get in and see a property and take a tour at a time that makes sense for them, as opposed to the standard business hours that leasing offices are historically open. So more people coming on site without them necessarily being validated or in any way sort of vetted, and entering the property and entering a unit and taking a tour on their own.
Right.
Additionally, in most times when we experience the most financial hardship and we see a recession, we tend to see fraudulent behavior increase on all fronts. As unfortunately, as people become more desperate, they'll take more extreme actions to get what they need. And so historically, we'd see an uptick in fraud as the economy sort of worsens. But hopefully, as things get better and everything reopens, we see that begin to flatten out a bit. And then I think the fourth big driver that we're seeing is it's easier than ever to obtain fake documents, right? Most people with decent knowledge of the internet could get online and probably buy a fake ID or buy a fake passport and buy fake pay stubs and other altered documents or fake documents in just a matter of minutes. And they're out there trying to use those documents to obtain things like housing and other products that they'd want to purchase. And so I think we've sort of seen the perfect storm over the last few years of technology, economic hardship, and just an adoption of online technologies that have created new problems for landlords to solve. And so with that, kind of like to get into picking Paul's brain a little bit. And so, Paul, thanks for your introduction and sort of telling us your backstory. More specifically, getting into fraud and risk management. As you look back over the last several years, when did you first start to encounter fraud in the property management space?
It first started becoming prevalent to us at Sterling in around late 2015 and 2016 is when we really started seeing it. Now, interestingly enough, to one of the points you made, we implemented online leasing in 2014. How much of a correlation there is I'll leave that up to up to you. That's up to question there. But it started spiking then, and then again in 2018 and 2019, it started becoming more prevalent again, and in more markets.
All right. And what specific types of fraud were you seeing? Were the two different things you saw maybe in 2015, 2016, and then later different, or were you sort of seeing the same things over and over?
No, they were different. I learned a term fairly recently, but it's exactly what was happening originally, and that term is muling. So that's when a person, an applicant, basically acts for somebody else, and once they're approved, they're not actually the one living in the apartment. That initially was the larger percentage of the fraudulent situations we had. Then there was the fictitious identities, or the where people were either completely false identity or where they were manipulating their information slightly. I'm not 100% sure whether or not we weren't catching the second, where they were just fraudulent identities as much as we were in the beginning with the muling. But as we got into 2019, 2020, 2021, the fraudulent identity seemed to be a little bit more prevalent.
Interesting. Any specific markets where you saw this more so than maybe in other markets?
Yes, definitely. It's funny, we have a large portfolio in New York City, and that's where you might expect it to be more, where we would have caught it more. But it first was reported to us back in 2015, 2016 by our third-party property managers. We had a lot of fund properties, all multifamily, and these specifically, and this was like Arizona, Texas, were two of the first markets that it started occurring on a somewhat regular basis. Then, a couple of years later, it started popping up a lot more in South Florida, and that's where it really seemed to spike a lot more for us. And we had very few cases in New York City.
That's interesting. So something we've heard from a number of operators, Paul, is that they're kind of addressing this on a market by market basis, right? And I think you kind of touched on that. You're seeing things in some cities, but other cities like New York, you're not. And so up till now, have you sort of taken a market by market approach to solving for these types of situations, or are you rolling out sort of one size fits all solutions for your portfolio, both during your day job and running the family business?
It's interesting, and it's probably the answer is a little bit different there. I think initially we were thinking of it on a market by market solution, and working with our third party property managers. What we were finding is that the solution really was the same in a larger scale situation when you're talking about Sterling, okay? Where in the smaller portfolio with LVPM, it was a little bit more market driven. So the solutions initially were us just learning, what these people were doing, how they were getting away with it, and what the potential problems associated with this were. The difference of somebody living in one of these units because someone was misrepresented. That might have been just a family member getting somebody else in, or it might have been somebody who had bad credit. It may have not really been a real devious situation, and they were paying their rents on time. So, a lot of those times we just try to let them finish up their lease and get them out with no real legal action. But what we started doing is learning more, implementing and enforcing the use of screening tools and background checks. And in the more recent years, we learned about and have implemented identity verification tools for people coming on site before they see the apartment. What you said earlier was exactly right. These people want to come on the weekends. They want to come after work, and it was in certain markets that was getting crazy when people, you couldn't control things during business hours. And with the online leasing, all of those things made life more complicated. So we basically have implemented those tools kind of across the board for our out-of-town multifamily properties. Now, in the smaller markets, smaller portfolio, we've kind of done the same thing. We're trying to learn how to enforce it differently, because it's a whole different cost structure when you're talking about somebody who owns under 100 units, and how to handle those on an individual basis, whether or not to use a broker that might be working for a firm that has that. But if they're doing that, what are they using? It's a little more complicated, a little more tricky, and a little more to navigate in the smaller portfolio manager. Frankly, a lot of times the people that were doing the leasing sometimes just relied on their gut feel, how they felt about a person when they were coming in, which we both know is not necessarily the best way to vet somebody. So until, in 2017, we implemented Breeze on the smaller portfolio, and that has really opened up our eyes, and we've learned the ability to do all kinds of, whether it's background checks or other types of identity verification, is that it's opened up a new world for the smaller market. So it's a little bit different in the larger market and the smaller market, and I'm excited that the smaller market is catching up.
That's great to hear. Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. What are your concerns about fraud, right? Like what do you, and maybe you can speak to it from both sides, right? As part of a big owner operator, what are the primary concerns about fraudulent behavior happening at the property versus operating the family business? Are your concerns with fraud different there or the same? Could you talk about that a little bit for us?
Absolutely. I think they're similar, but there's differences. And the difference is probably more financial when you talk about the large versus the small. But as far as the number one concern that I have, that the family has, as far as the smaller portfolio, and this is the same for the larger portfolio with Sterling, safety and security, both for our leasing agents and for your neighbors or prospective, the tenants that live there and whoever might be moving in. Even in the situation where people were misrepresenting who they are. I mean, are they trying to do this as an Airbnb or something like that? Or you don't really know who your neighbor is going to be. So safety and security are paramount. Those are our biggest concerns. And that's true for both size portfolios. Then you talk about financial. The larger companies, the larger owners and property managers can survive, the financial hit much easier. And that's both loss in rent or even some legal fees that might go with it. That's not necessarily the case for the small guy. Now, the family operated portfolio or the individual property managers, the financial hit can be much bigger because you've got to deal with legal, and you've got to deal with getting marshals in, or you've got to deal with evicting tenants and loss of rent. So that's a much bigger financial hit. So I would weigh that heavier on the family size portfolio property management situation than I would on the Sterling. But safety and security are by far, I think, the most important for everyone, for all sides.
That's great. Yeah, I would agree. And, we saw something interesting if I think back 10 to 15 years ago or so, when criminal background checks first became prevalent in multifamily, or at least the ability to do a multi-state or national criminal background check in a very short timeline. And so those came onto the scene between 2005 and 2010. And we sort of saw this situation where, like most things, the bigger guys are going to adopt them first. Right. And they either have the budgets to do it or the scale to pull it off. But essentially what ends up happening is you kind of create this funnel from the properties that are using all of these risk management tools to capture or to catch on to these different behaviors. And it kind of drives all the people that are trying to perform these fraudulent acts or to hide things from their past to the properties that aren't using all of those tools.
Correct.
Right. And so I'm curious if we'll see if, fraud is the criminal background checks of the 2020s. Right. Yeah. Where we're going to sort of see the haves and the have-nots, where the the properties that, have put these tools in place and have embraced a culture of preventing fraud, kind of do a good job deflecting it, and for better or worse, sending it down the street to where the properties maybe aren't using as sophisticated tools or technologies to catch on to it and prevent it. Any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. And it's these people are smarter than you think. And one of the things I probably should have also mentioned in the prior question was, one of the hits is also reputation management, right? Okay, so and if a building is using sophisticated screening versus a building that's not a property, people figure that out, and that is a big hit to a larger property manager as well. So if you go way back, I remember those days. It was you always had your financial and then the criminal, and there was charges for each, and it wasn't cheap. And some people didn't enforce maybe the one or the other, but a lot of times they'll do the financial, they didn't do the criminal. But as the larger companies adopted these tools, like you said, the people, they find the buildings that aren't using it, the properties that aren't using it, or the markets that don't do it. And as somebody that is a nationwide property manager, we start seeing that spike differently. The smaller guy is not going to see that. So I think the availability and the price point per unit or per application has gotten better for everybody over the years. And adopting that, definitely the haves have done a better job. And I can tell you right now, there's certain companies that these people will absolutely stay away from, because they know they have they're big companies, they have the funds, they're doing every possible type of background check they can, including identity verification coming to the property. And they have little to no occurrences. The ones that aren't exactly in that situation are having a greater number of these situations occur. And I've seen it. I've seen it for the last 10 years or 15 years. And finding a solution that fits, that is affordable for the different levels is starting to be available. I see more and more, and I'm excited about that.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Yeah, I think we've always felt that so much of this is just so many of the tools available, and similar to what happened years ago with criminal background checks and sort of some of the other screening tools. They're just as much a deterrent as they are a tool to catch bad behavior.
100%.
Right, and by marketing that you're doing these things and making it known to applicants, hopefully you can kind of steer someone down the street or around the corner to someone else's property. And we've sort of used the analogy that it's like the club for your car, if you remember what that is.
Yeah.
Paul, you probably remember. A lot of our younger viewers today might not know. That's right. But the big orange, steel bar that goes on your steering wheel, right? And the whole goal of the club wasn't for someone to look at it and say, hey, you know what? I bet I can saw through that before the police get here and get away with this car.
Right.
No, the goal was that they would see the club, and that's why it was such a bright color. And they would just move on to the next car that didn't have the club on it.
Yeah.
Right. And so, some are making the argument that a lot of these tools today are becoming the club of multifamily security and property management, risk management. So kind of interesting.
Sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
I couldn't agree more. And I in the last several years, the introduction, or at least the adoption of the identification tools for the person coming to visit the site or the property, that is the club to me, more so than the background checks that have been around for years. They have to have really put an effort into falsifying photo identification, and then coming on site. And that in and of itself, just the thought of doing it, I think has been a big deterrent. And that is something we just recently did on a larger portfolio. And I say about a year or so ago. And we're trying to figure out how to do that on a smaller portfolio. And I think it's coming. And my excitement level is peaking.
That's awesome. So I think that makes for a great sort of transition into some of the things we're seeing and the solutions that are available to help landlords, big and small, combat fraud. And so let me jump into some of these. And so there's four primary areas that we're seeing fraudulent behavior happen, and where we're working to put solutions in place to help prevent things and to at least give a second look at behavior that seems like it might be fraudulent. And so first and foremost, we spent a lot of time talking to it today, but it's identity verification, right? And so we had a lot of situations hearing from clients that people were coming in with fake IDs or someone else's ID, or what's become popular is a synthetic identity, which is basically if I was to use my name and your social security number and someone else's date of birth. So all real data elements, but that don't lead back to any one person that actually exists.
Correct.
And so there's a number of solutions on the market today to help combat this. And we offer some of these through our Breeze platform. But it's essentially to scan a driver's license or a passport or whatever government issued ID a person might have to authenticate that it's real, and then also have the person take a selfie and do a biometric match of the picture in the selfie to the picture on the government issued ID. Right. So not just is the ID real, but also is the person that gave it to us the person who's on it, right? And so that's kind of the most upfront piece. The next two kind of go together, but in a lot of cases, it's about an applicant trying to conceal potential things in their background when we get into doing sort of a screening. And so it could be leaving out or changing a middle initial or a middle name. As most people would be familiar with, when we get into doing criminal background checks or potentially civil court checks to see if anyone's been to landlord and tenant court, anything we can do to have as much matching as possible is a benefit. And so having those middle names and having those middle initials can be a big help in terms of getting the best possible results back. There's also some tools that the credit bureaus make available whenever data elements get entered into the screening platform and sent to the credit bureaus. So if a social security number is a mismatch, or if an address is flagged as being high risk, there are alerts that the credit bureaus will send back letting you know that something about the information that was provided, either the name, the date of birth, the address, the social security number, has been reported as being high risk, and we should give it a little better look. And so there's tools in place to kind of pause the leasing process there until someone that the property manager trusts can sort of verify that this is correct and we should move forward with this person. And an example of that might be asking someone for a copy of their social security card if there was an alert that the social security number was reported as invalid. And then the last piece, and what I would say is sort of the newest frontier, is getting in and combating people who are providing fake pay stubs and other fake income documents. And so it's become pretty simple in the last few years to obtain identification documents online and obtain other things like pay stubs. But there's a number of emerging technologies to help on this piece as well. And so some of those are using third-party pay stub validations. And so uploading a PDF and putting it through some AI to figure out if it's a real document, if it's been altered at all, and then to extrapolate how much income a person actually makes to compare that and figure out, okay, does this person make enough money to pay our rent and meet our rental requirements? There's other solutions where applicants or consumers can now give you access to their bank account, right? And if people have refinanced their homes or gone through and gotten a loan online anytime recently, you probably would have experienced this. But essentially, there's algorithms that can look at people's bank account activity and derive what their income is. And then we can use that to compare to the rent to income standards to make sure that the person makes enough to qualify. And then sort of the third piece is using third-party repositories of companies that store payroll data. And so there's companies out there similar to the credit bureaus that collect this data from employers. And so instead of having to ask a consumer to provide copies of anything or to log into a system, we can just go tap into those databases and see if we can get via a neutral third party someone's payroll history and salary information. So sort of putting all these pieces together can help create a stable platform to help limit fraud. And we talk to some housing operators who are at one end of the spectrum, and they'll sort of tell us that, fraud has become our top issue, and our leadership has made statements to the whole company that it's everyone's job to fight it, and we're investing in these tools, and we're going to have no tolerance towards fraud or fraudulent behavior. And then there's folks at the other end of the spectrum who want to put heads in beds at all costs and fill as many apartments as possible that will generate some revenue. Right. And so, we hope to kind of make the various solutions available for everyone, regardless of where you fit on that spectrum and what your risk tolerance is for fraudulent activity. And then finally, we just wanted to sort of end today with some tips for fraud mitigation in property management. And so first and foremost is to sort of embed an anti-fraud belief into your corporate culture, right? And so make sure it's talked about, and make sure people know to be on the lookout for it, and that it's not going to be tolerated, and that actions will be taken. Second, and I think it's what we spend most of our time on here today, is implement the right combination of fraud tools to align with your risk tolerance. And so these solutions are out there, and at this point, they're available to landlords large and small. And so just finding the right combination of products that align with your goals should be straightforward in today's marketplace. And then third, maybe most importantly, is keeping up with evolving technologies. The fraudsters tend to be very sharp and on the cutting edge. And so in most cases, they're doing things that we haven't thought about how to solve for yet. And so like most technological solutions, these tools are going to change every 6 or 12 or 18 months. And so what you have in place to help fight fraud today might not be as effective a year from now or 2 years from now. And so it's going to be important to sort of stay on the cutting edge and make sure that we're always as up to date as we can be with the solutions available to help combat with what's become a major problem for us. Paul, anything else you'd like to add to tips or suggestions?
Yeah, it's funny. On the prior slide, the last two, the yellow and the green circles, there's a couple things to avoid that we stepped in both the large, Sterling and at LVPM, the large and the small. One is ignoring those risk notifications when the Social Security was off by 1 digit or something like that. So we were actually notified, but they did that purposely, and we were like, "Oh, listen," they pushed it through. That happened on a couple of specific instances that came to my attention. And then the last circle was something that you said that is very interesting. That this is more the smaller guy that didn't do the screening through a third-party service, but would just get the copies of the pay stubs. And somebody who has had the experience in technology for as long as I have, I can modify a PDF in 5 minutes. And just relying on the pay stub that was sent to you electronically is also another problem that we encountered. People did modify their pay stubs, and we let it go through, and we found out later. So there's some of those. The last two are very important, and there's some gotchas there if you're not careful and you don't follow the proper protocols. Other than that,
for sure,
you're absolutely right.
That's great. Well, thank you, Paul, for being here today and doing this with us. And thank you, everyone, for spending a little time with us to catch up on fraud and multifamily. We hope you found this valuable. And thanks again, Paul. Have a great day.
All right, guys. Take care.